It is May 23rd, 2019. We are again broadcasting live to you today from the Mormon Stories Podcast studios in Salt Lake City, Utah. We are very, very excited for today's interview. As always, this is an interview that's special and personal to me. As I've gotten to know this guest, I think this is a person, a personality, a human, a soul that people in my community need to get to know and will benefit from knowing about. Today's interview is with a dear friend of mine that I learned about through my cousin Thomas Hatton, or Wam as I like to call him. My sister Julianne Hatton, her son Thomas, is a dear nephew of mine, and he became friends with Spencer Nugent. And Spencer has a fascinating Mormon story. Spencer, along with his parents and siblings, were the first Jamaicans baptized on the island into the Mormon church. And actually, Spencer's parents were baptized before he was born. Spencer was raised in Jamaica as an active devout Mormon, along with his parents. Went to high school there. Eventually, he and his family moved to Orem, Utah, where Spencer attended UVSC and eventually BYU. Spencer served a mission to San Antonio, Texas, and then he pursued a career as an industrial designer. I learned about the term Renaissance man when I visited Monticello in Virginia to learn about Thomas Jefferson and all the things that Thomas Jefferson was able to do. And as I've learned a little bit about Spencer, I have been incredibly impressed with all of his abilities. He's a singer. He plays the guitar. He loves art. He's a drawer. He's a designer professionally. He loves to travel. He does his own landscape architecture. He's a teacher. He's got an Instagram channel and a YouTube channel. It's called Sketchaday.
Sketchaday.com.
Sketchaday.com. You can check that out. Just an amazing human, wise, thoughtful, and he hates all of this part of the introduction, I'm sure. After Spencer got married in the temple in Salt Lake City and had two sons, he and his, what is now his ex-wife, eventually experienced a Mormon faith crisis together and eventually got divorced. So today's episode is going to be another one of those multi-hour epic Mormon Stories interviews where we dig deep. We're going to cover many important topics, including Mormon cultural imperialism and whitewashing as it relates to Jamaica, and also the positive aspects of what Mormonism brings to, people outside of the United States in a country like Jamaica. Because it's good and bad. That's at least my experience of what I believe. We'll see if Spencer would agree. He's shaking his head yes, so I think he would. We're going to talk about what it's like to be black in the Mormon church, both in Jamaica and also here in the United States. We're going to talk about Spencer's mission. We're going to talk about his marriage. We're going to be talking about parenting. Spencer also experienced male eating disorders, so we're going to talk about that. We are going to talk about divorce, losing your faith crises kind of stuff, and what it's like to find identity, morality, and community as a black ex-Mormon man in Utah. And that's intense. So I think it's intense. Spencer, you can tell us if it actually is intense or if it's chill. I don't know. But we're so excited to have you here, Spencer. Thank you so much for joining us on Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you, John. Thank you. It's good to be here. Kind of surreal, actually. But
any corrections on the introduction? Or
no, you did great. Actually, you did too much.
All right.
Yeah.
I apologize for that.
It's all good.
Not really. Sorry, not sorry. Okay. So without any further ado, let's just jump in.
All right.
To your story, because I think people are going to really value it. So tell us about how your parents first learned. Well, tell us whatever you want to about the history of the Mormon church in Jamaica that precedes your parents becoming the first baptized converts on the island.
Okay. So
And any disclaimers you want to offer before we start?
yeah, I'll probably sprinkle disclaimers in throughout. Well, first of all, I'm no historian, and what I'm telling you is largely, the oral history of the church in Jamaica and my family's experience. So, if I mess up or miss any details, my apologies to everyone. But the gist of it is, there actually were missionaries who went to Jamaica. I think it was in the 1800s, a long, long time ago, and they didn't have a lot of success. So it wasn't until the 1970s when my family, my parents specifically, they had a friend who was an expat on the island. So companies would have businesses on the island. They sent these expats who happened to be Mormon. And at the time, so I guess going back a bit further, my parents, clearly they didn't grow up Mormon. So my mother, her background was Episcopalian or Anglican, and my father actually grew up as a Jehovah's Witness.
Whoa,
so
that's intense.
yeah,
Do you know about that at all? We've covered that with one interview on Mormon Stories.
I did listen. I did listen to that
okay.
one. Got into the weeds on that one, but and learned a ton. As far as my father goes, however, I just recall him mentioning that they would go out ministering. They would, proselytize, I guess. I forgot the correct term that they used. So I remember that. The majority of his family is still Jehovah's Witness practicing as well.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah. So he shared a couple experiences of going out with his father, his family, teaching, preaching, that kind of thing. So that was his background, and it's really easy to find. You can just Google Jamaican Nugent, and you'll see his whole story. So
on from the Ensign or LDS.org or
because they were the first, they met a lot of significant leaders, people in the church that would interview them. Hartman Rector Jr. did, I think it was in his book No More Strangers. There was an interview with my father where he tells his whole experience from his perspective. But essentially, he left the Jehovah's Witness faith in his, I guess you could say, early 20s or thereabouts. Basically, when he went to college, he became an atheist, and his experience, as he tells it, is something along the lines of just being completely outside of any context of religion, living a worldly life, you could say. And one day he was coming home and he felt inspired to kneel down and pray, and he did. And I always loved that part of the story. We can talk about where I'm at now in my life spiritually later, but for him, I always thought it was touching that he felt inspired to reach out for some answers. So he did, and he felt inspired to read the Bible. So that's what he did. He would, and I remember this growing up, he would still read the Bible obsessively. But at this particular time, when he was working with his expat friend at this company, it was an alumina plant. That's the raw material used to make all your aluminum foil that you use. This friend noticed that he was reading the Bible, asked what he was doing, and mentioned that he was a Mormon. That night, went over, showed a film strip reel. I think it was called Man's Search for Happiness or Meet the Mormons. I don't remember the correct title, but that was when they had the little film canisters, and I still remember those growing up.
Dude.
Yep, exactly. Yep. So that film strip projector. So they had that presentation, and right then and there, as my dad says, he knew he wanted to be baptized. My mom, she took a little extra time.
So he watched The Man's Search for Happiness.
Yep.
Film strip.
He watched that. He read the Book of Mormon voraciously, finished it, and was just convinced this is...
Did he have, what level of education did your parents have?
Oh, good question. So my dad, his background was in botany and zoology, I believe, with some chemistry. So
university?
Scientific, yes. He went to University of the West Indies in Jamaica. That's where he studied. And you could say he's a little bit like me. He does a lot of different things as well. My mother never did go to college, but she was actually one of the first computer operators back when computers were, room-sized things on the island. And I wasn't alive then, but I've seen photos of her doing that. But she was, for the majority of my life, she was a stay-at-home mom. She had a couple business ventures that she did on the side here and there. She used to do baked goods and sell them, that kind of thing. But yeah, my dad was college educated at that time.
Okay. So he went from Jehovah's Witness to atheist.
Yes.
To seeing the missionaries. And were there missionaries?
It wasn't missionaries. It was members of the church who were sent to Jamaica to, not by the church.
In the aluminum?
In the aluminum industry, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Mining, you could say. Mining and refining. So they were just there. There was no church on the island. There was no infrastructure.
Do you remember the name of the families? Or
Yeah. The name is Schmeil. Schmeil. Schmeil.
So Brother Schmeil would have worked for an aluminum kind of aluminum plant, and he would have met your dad. And
yeah, just like seeing a coworker playing your favorite video game, and you go, "Hey, what are you doing?" And you connect that way. So that's kind of what happened for him.
Okay, and so. Have you talked to your dad about what it was about the message or the film strip, the doctrine, the teachings, the missionary that really connected with him? As an atheist,
I don't know specifically. I remember a few details from his telling of the story. He, in his reading of the Bible, he had almost like a Joseph Smith-like experience, you could say, where he realized, the true church, if you will, should have a priesthood. It should have some authority. It's set up a certain way. And he, in his retelling of this, essentially said that he just realized that churches on the earth didn't really embody what he read and what he felt was a representation of how God would run things. So that part of the message resonated with him. It was also a conflict for him in a way, but he resolved it. And what I mean to say is he actually got baptized in 1974, which was 4 years before the priesthood revelation. So part of the presentation was, hey, that's great. You want to be a part of this, but I need to let you know, here's how the church views people of your race. So that was something he had to come to grips with, and my mother as well. He quoted a scripture in Psalms. I forgot the actual reference, but it was something to the effect of, I'd rather be a doorman or something, at the stand at the door than enter the place of the faithful, or something like that. It's a Psalm. I think it's Psalm 84:10 if it's coming back to me. But that was somewhat bittersweet for me because it spoke to his realization that, hey, this is something I want to be a part of, but I can't really fully be a part of that. And I think he came to grips with that part. But as far as what resonated, he just realized, based on his reading, his study, that to him at the time, the Mormon Church was the closest thing to what he had read about.
And just to be explicit, I think you just referenced this, but were they baptized before 1978?
Yes, so, January 20th, 1974.
Okay, so 4 years before the church allowed, Black people of African descent or of color to receive the priesthood, to attend the temple.
Yeah. So he had a lot of experiences. Really poignant, powerful, profound experiences of, I think, butting up against that reality. There was one he shared in particular where, I'll share good and bad, I guess. The good, just feeling the part of something, some energy, something that was good for him. He felt like it was a good fit. But there was also the struggle of, hey, what happens when we need to pay tithing, or what happens when we need to baptize our child? There's no branch. There's no leadership. there's a bunch of people hanging out on the island, as an unestablished unit. But he butt up against that. There were cultural things too. And what I mean to say is there was the doctrine of exclusion for blacks from priesthood ordinances, or at least officiating. But there was also cultural things that happened where, members interpreting as they would made choices that, in hindsight, were hurtful or were discriminatory. So, for example, not being allowed in elders' quorum meeting. He would sit outside.
Once there was a branch.
Well, it wasn't so much a branch as it was a unit. So it wasn't an official branch. So there were expats on the island. They would all meet in someone's home.
Okay.
And then they would rotate between homes or among the homes.
Cottage meetings or
cottage meeting, exactly.
Home church or whatever.
Exactly. So the elders would go together, or the priesthood members rather, and then my dad would sit outside the door as he was instructed to, and he would read for an hour, read the Book of Mormon, Bible, and that kind of thing.
Excluded, physically
excluded from entering the room. Yes.
Okay, so like it's as I think about people of color joining the Mormon Church prior to 1978, you hear stories about an African fellow stumbling on a Book of Mormon and reading it and writing Salt Lake City saying, how do I become a member? And I can get that. They read a book. It's talking about Jesus. It's talking about their salvation. They're inspired. They want to be a part of whatever. And there's no real rewards or, branches anyway, but they still want to be a part however they can. And especially if they maybe have a certain level of education, but then not an advanced level of education. And let's just say there have been centuries and centuries of exclusion or slavery or bigotry or whatever. It's just like, well, that's just our world. Like, we're discriminated against. So, like, what else is new? Mormonism outside of Mormonism. When it comes to the 70s, post Martin Luther King, which I'm assuming the news of the Martin Luther King civil rights movement would have reached Jamaica, so post 1964. And someone who is more highly educated. This is after the Black Panthers, this is after the Black Power movement, all that stuff. In the way I think about history and reflect back on it, an educated black man, no matter what country they lived in, would simply read about the church or learn about the church, find out about the exclusion policy and say, no way.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no freaking way.
Yeah.
Like, F you, church. Like, I'm not joining a church that excludes me. Have you talked to your dad or mom about, like, that process?
There's a lot there in that question.
Break it down.
Coming to mind
take the time,
because being at the point I'm in my life now, I'm trying to make an effort to understand more about their experiences. And we've had conversations along those lines where... all of this will come into focus, but, discovering or embracing my blackness and learning about that and becoming passionate about the struggle, if you will, and being somewhat at odds with where my parents are now and their understanding of the struggle. They've referenced their youth and their passion and their zeal for the struggle as well. And by the struggle, I mean, racial discrimination, the civil rights movement, all of that stuff. So,
wasn't Jamaican founded? Jamaica, was it like was it colonized? Europeans?
Yeah, so a little bit of history there. Jamaica is one of the former countries that was part of the British Commonwealth. So, historically speaking, the indigenous people of Jamaica were what you would consider Native Americans. They were on the island. The Spaniards came, and there was genocide. They were all killed off, and so they needed a labor force. So they went to Africa, India, China, and imported humans.
Real quick, the racial background of the indigenous people of Jamaica would be comparable to the Mayas and Aztecs and Incas?
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
And
they were.
any of those people?
Those people do not exist. They were completely.
They don't exist.
Yes, they were completely eradicated.
Oh my gosh! I have never thought about
so
that.
There's a museum on the island that has artifacts, stories, but there are no people of that
I feel gutted right
ethnicity
now.
on the island. Yeah, it's a horrible thing to think about. Slavery, the slave trade, imperialism. You think about blacks from Africa, but there was also a clearing of peoples that happened so that these imperialists could take advantage of the land and resources. So there's that, right? Yeah.
Okay. So then they what are the main crops or agricultural?
There's a lot of sugarcane.
Okay.
In fact, my father, his profession was in the orange juice industry for a large part of my life. And that's another big crop.
So there's oranges, sugar.
Yep, oranges, sugarcane. There's the raw material for aluminum. It's called bauxite, Bauxite. It's this red dirt that they process. So that's a big one. And then there's just farming in general. I guess marijuana is a big thing now since it's legal there. I don't think it's legal to export, but certainly that's something there. But above all of that, it would probably be tourism is a big part of industry there.
Like resorts and
resorts,
hotels,
hospitality.
casinos.
No casinos to my knowledge. Maybe that's changed. It's been a while since.
And
I've
has there traditionally been a predominant religious culture in the island, like Catholicism?
Yeah.
Or?
So because of the history of the British and Spaniards coming over, they took us from Africa and gave us religion. So that's why most Jamaicans are Christian. If not Christian, there's a small subset of Rastafarians. I'm not sure if there's Muslims, probably. I don't remember interacting with many growing up. But largely, most people are Christian on some
But not
level.
Catholic?
There were Catholics.
Predominantly
I actually went to a
Catholic?
Catholic high school.
Okay.
There are Catholics, Baptists, Pentecostals. So the type of church where you speak in tongues and have those miracles. Mormons are just a blip compared to everything else.
But no one predominant religious tradition.
No,
synonymous with the island.
Christianity in aggregate would be the tradition, but there's no indigenous or local religion. There is a practice of what's called obia, similar to voodoo, that some people practice. That's kind of a carryover or holdover from when slaves were brought onto the island, but that's about it.
So, is it just a fact then that your parents' ancestors would have been slaves?
Yeah, actually, that's a heavy question. Because my last name is actually the last name of
Nugent.
Nugent.
Spell it for us.
Nugent, just like Ted.
Okay.
No relation, but I say that all the time. But my last name is the last name of the last slave owner of the line of people my family came from. So Peter Nugent, that's the ancestor who settled the area of the island that my family is from. He acquired a Christian name, but also the name of his slave owner. And so that's been propagated through time, and here I am. So
I think of Nugent as a Vietnamese name. I don't know why.
Well, that's a Nguyen. That's Nguyen, I think.
Okay.
It's pronounced Nguyen.
Okay.
But yeah,
Nugent. And of what nationality that Nugent slave owner character?
Oh, so we're from, I believe it's Guinea Coast, so the western Africa.
I meant the slave owner.
Oh, the slave owner. I'm not sure.
Would it be British, probably? Or?
It wasn't British. It was either Irish or Scottish. But
and then your ancestors.
Yeah, so my ancestors, my lineage goes back to West Africa.
Okay,
that's
you're saying
from.
Guinea
Coast, yes.
Guinea Coast.
Mm-hmm. That's as far as we know.
And have you guys tried to do genealogy?
My parents are obsessive about it and have been really passionate. I guess passionate's a better word. And so they've been able to go as far back as the African coast. Unfortunately, there's not much beyond that. And
so do they know when their first ancestors came to Jamaica about?
We have an idea. It would have been, in the 16 or 1700s, around about that time. But
okay.
Yeah,
I'm breathing deeply. I'm just heavy stuff.
It is heavy. It is heavy. It's something I've thought about a lot, particularly as I've moved into this new phase of life, and trying to piece together an identity, realizing that a piece of me is tied to this Christian mindset that was imposed on my people, and also my name. And how do I come to grips with that? And that's been a struggle. A bit.
Just as a side note, one of the most important books I ever read was the autobiography of Malcolm X. Hopefully most of you have heard of Malcolm X. I'm sure most of you have. When the Nation of Islam really rose to prominence in the 50s and 60s, it sort of had this practice of having its adherents replace their slave name, as they called it, with the term X. Not only so that they're not using a slave name anymore, but also as this big reminder that their whole genealogy and history was erased with the slave trade. And so Malcolm X, the term X, is a replacement of Malcolm Little, whose ancestors were slaves.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. Like I said, I'm still coming into my own. It's something I've considered, but at this point in life, the
changing your name?
Yeah, I mean the cost to that is significant. It's no small thing, but. It's something I think about. Whether or not I do it, we'll see.
And it's a phenomenal book for anyone who wants to read it. And the story of the Nation of Islam very much parallels the story of Mormonism with the charismatic founder, and the founder ends up being a polygamist, and Malcolm X has to have his own enlightenment, and it's a great movie. Spike Lee directs the movie as well. It's great stuff. Anyway,
but yeah, going back to your question. My dad often referred to himself when he was, or described himself when he was younger as being, socialist, very liberal, very progressive in his ideals and thinking. And I
one last question. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
What year was slavery abolished in Jamaica? Do you have any?
Oh, sense? You're putting me on the spot.
Any
now.
idea? Like what century? What century? Approximately.
It was the 19th century.
Okay,
so that'd be the 1800s.
So mid 19th century, probably around the time it was abolished.
I think it was 1860, if I recall. Yes,
and that's when the Civil War started in the United States.
I think so. Okay. Maybe not.
Okay. Well,
I've got a lot of dates jumbling around in my head right now.
1800s would have been abolished.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you know anything about how your parents' ancestors sort of rose from literal slaves to middle class? Like, what would you have said?
Yeah, I mean, in Jamaica, we were middle class, you could say. The economics of moving to another country certainly shifts that balance in some significant ways, and we've had to kind of start that journey again. But
so you say your dad was liberal or progressive?
Yeah, he was liberal or progressive. Yes, when he was younger, educated. As far as our family, like progressing and getting to where we are, when slavery ended. My ancestor Peter was awarded a plot of land, if you will, or area of Jamaica. I'm not sure the reasons. There's probably reasons in journals somewhere, but that became Nugentville, I think.
Really?
Which got renamed to Bell Castle. Yes.
Oh.
So.
That's 40 acres and a mule, right?
I'm not sure if it was I should look up the actual area, but it was a significant.
In the U.S. Where I think weren't slaves granted in the U.S.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Sorry, random thought here, but I was just thinking the condition of the black person in Jamaica and the United States is somewhat different. So I've been trying to. Hold information from both, and so that's why I was a little bit stupid at your question there. But as far as the land goes, we had that as a family, not my personal family, but my ancestors, and that became our land to work. And there was a town, and so I have a lot of family in that particular chunk of Jamaica is what I'm saying. So we had that to work off. They worked the land. education was always big for me and my family, something that was stressed. So we always worked hard in school and tried to excel, and it's kind of where or rather how we ended up where we were.
Would your grandparents have been more highly educated, or would they have just been farmers? And your dad's a first generation university student.
I'm fairly certain my grandpa did not go to college, or my grandmother. They were farmers.
Okay.
At least on my father's side. On my mother's side, they were educators. So they were principal and I think teacher at the local high school. Yeah. Nice. And my parents met in high school. That's how they met.
And tell me about the socialism part of your dad's upbringing. I'm just curious about that.
So he, again, this is just as far as I've been told. But essentially being pro social programs, giving back to people, not leaning in so heavily into capitalism or conservative ideals that at face value can seem to neglect others in society, the working class. Yeah. So he was a big proponent of what's called the Labor Party in Jamaica. And that was, I think at the time, was it Labor? I don't remember, but was it Michael Manley? Politics are interesting in Jamaica, certainly like the British system. But in any case, that was kind of his thing. I mean, when I say liberal and he was of a socialistic mindset, it wasn't so much that gay marriage was a thing. I mean, right. Jamaica is or has been one of the most homophobic countries in the world. So it's been interesting, myself even, growing out of those ideals and mores, if you will. So for him, it was more about being considerate for people in general, giving back to the working class. Okay,
so this was a really good background to a question that I started with, which and I was wanting the background, but it's like I'm checking off the boxes of like my values today, which is like, all right, he's educated, middle class, secular atheist, like socialist. Like I'm thinking, wow, that's really good trajectory, right?
2 degrees in college, yeah.
Yeah, and then freaking joins a racist church. Like, again.
I mean, that's one way to put it.
No, an exclusionary racist church. And I love Mormonism. Like, I don't mean to be shocking my listeners. I love the church. But I mean, from his paradigm, he's educated, he's secular, he's like riding the wave. And then he's learning about this theology that some now says sounds fanciful or crazy or like, whatever, along with being racist.
Yeah. In the No More Strangers account, again, you can find that online. I believe the phrase he used to describe the discrimination was a fly in the ointment, meaning this was the one thing that was hard or heavy. But given his feelings about the doctrine, the presentation that he had, I think, and I'm extrapolating here a bit, but his association with Paul, he thought Paul is the gentleman who introduced him to the church. So Paul, he describes Paul as just one of the best people he knows. So I think that was probably part of it, feeling like, well, if Paul is so great, this thing must be great.
So it's a social conversion at minimum.
At minimum, yes.
But also kind of a doctrinal, spiritual one.
Very doctrinal, very spiritual. Yes, absolutely, 100%. He was a firebrand. He was passionate about Mormonism in every sense of the word. And it was inspiring. I mean, it really was. I still feel chills telling his story because of his passion. Not necessarily that I agree with it all. Just I respect him for his passion and dedication, devotion to his ideals. But yeah, that was a sticking point. He was able to overcome it, and I've heard many justifications. Specifically, the one that comes to mind is in the Old Testament, the Aaronic order, if you will, the Levites. They were the ones who were allowed to officiate. They were the ones with the priest, and so he created an analogy there that I think.
There's biblical basis, right?
Maybe that was the first stick under the shelf for him back in the day. And and I am not going to speak to his shelf. I'm sure it's intact based on how he lives his life. But certainly that was something that was told to me that helped me in my acceptance of that discrimination.
From my position of privilege, being able to like pick and choose exactly what I want to do in life almost in every aspect, I'm like flying the ointment. That's like taking a dump in the ointment. Like that would be a deal killer from day one. But what I'm imagining what I'm not considering is, just the way social dynamics work and history and oppression, how that's going to play into someone saying it's just a fly versus like a major, major obstacle or like a deal killer. For me, in my privilege, that would just be a deal killer. I have to sit outside the elders quorum. Sorry, F you, I'm out of here. But for him, it was just a fly in the ointment.
Yeah, I mean, that was...
And your mom.
Yeah. To us, it might seem like a mountain, but I think one of the things I've learned as I've gotten older is to not necessarily apply my context to history. So I'm okay holding space and creating space to say, hey, maybe his place was such that it was just a fly in the ointment to him at the time. Maybe his heart was in a place to see it that way. For me, it's a bit harder, given, I think, the time I grew up in and my experiences that I've had, to just call it a fly in the ointment. In fact, that has been a big struggle for me in the past, and I think something that ultimately led to me transitioning out.
But if you think about, as I think about Guatemala, where I serve my mission, when you think about what the church, and in the United States, what the church does offer, I mean, that's the point, right? It offers spirituality, identity, community, theology, doctrine, hope, meaning, purpose, family support, sometimes financial or, sometimes support for just daily living, and a structure and morality,
Yeah,
that's a lot.
It's kind of this neat bundle that gets handed to you, and you're like, awesome. I think,
and great role models, right?
Yeah,
Teachers.
exactly. Like I said, he was impressed by Paul. And their family, and rightly so. They're great people. I still love them to this day.
You know them?
Yes, I do know them personally.
They're here in Utah, or
I believe I won't say exactly where they were, just to preserve their
okay.
somewhat anonymity, but they're in the Western United States. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So what was it like? So you were born in the covenant, is that right?
Yeah, interestingly enough. So to add to the historical context, in Jamaica at the time, again, as retold by my parents or passed on to us, there was a movement or push similar to China where I would say not as heavily enforced or imposed on people, but there was a push to limit population growth, because there were concerns, and maybe it was similar to the ideas in the U.S. at the time, zero population, that kind of thing. But the saying was, 2 is better than too many. So 2 is better than too many, meaning 2 children, that's it. So there are 5 children in my family, and the first 2 were the ones who were there in the 70s when my parents converted.
Kind of a zero population thing.
Yeah, just being sensitive to resources. Jamaica is about 160, 150 miles wide by about 50 or 60 miles top to bottom. So it's fairly small. We have limited resources. So there was some concern then. And my parents leaned into that, and they were like, yep, we're just having 2 kids. They had a boy and a girl. And when they joined the church, they were encouraged to have more children, because that's what we do. We are fruitful and we multiply and we fill the earth. So I owe my very existence to them converting to the Mormon church, because they were done.
Yeah, that's kind of humbling, right? You wouldn't exist without Mormonism.
Yeah, and as you can guess, my name comes from their love for the prophet at the time.
Spencer W. Kimball.
Yes, Spencer W. Kimball. My sister has a name that's associated there as well, but I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, they certainly leaned into that.
And there wasn't a temple when they would have in Jamaica. Is there one now?
There is no temple in Jamaica. So at the time I left the island, there were about 5,000 members. There were 2 districts on the island. Now now there are stakes that are on the island. People I grew up with are bishops and stake presidents, so it's kind of surreal. But as far as I know, the membership is under 10,000.
Okay.
I can fairly confidently say that. So there is no temple. The closest temple would be in the Dominican Republic.
Dominican Republic.
Yes.
DR.
That's
where Thomas went.
Yeah, that's where he went. Yep.
Shout out to Thomas. Love Thomas. Wom. So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but at some point, would your parents have been sealed in the temple then?
Yeah. So between 74 and 78, a few things happened. 78 being when the priesthood revelation happened. So my parents, some of this is just painful to recount because, again, my context is different than theirs. And just even thinking this would be so hard. But my parents expressed that when they were baptized, they knew that in this lifetime they would never have the priesthood.
Because that was doctrine.
I'm not sure why, and I believe that was said, not until all the sons of Adam are redeemed that.
Yeah, the first presidency issued a statement in the
Yes.
late 50s saying until all the white people get the priesthood,
Basically,
blacks
yeah.
will be getting it.
Yeah.
Right?
And I don't want to misquote, but yes, I'm familiar with that. And so they expressed that, and I remember hearing that as a child and just thinking, wow, that's heavy, A bit of awe, like, wow, that's a lot of faith, that's really cool, and a bit of shock and horror as well, and sadness. So they didn't expect or anticipate to ever
Go to the temple
ever go to temple, be sealed.
Oh.
Between 74 and 70, I'm not sure which year. My parents did visit Utah. So they got to go to BYU campus and tour it. They went to Temple Square. My dad described touching the temple and realizing I'll never enter this building, but it's so amazing. So yeah, they had those experiences. They didn't anticipate ever being able to, but they ended up getting sealed in the Salt Lake Temple. Again, before I was born. So I was born in the covenant in 82.
So have they, first of all, like from a believing Mormon perspective, the way that's framed is what incredible faith.
Yes.
Like one of our first interviewees on Mormon Stories was Darius Gray, who joined the church as like a reporter for KSL News, like years before the priesthood ban was lifted. And his story and all the other saints is like incredible faith. Yeah.
That's how I viewed it at the time. And I still view it as, wow, they have incredible faith. And I can respect that. Their conviction, their faith, their belief, their hope. I think, to me, that's admirable still.
Have they talked about when they heard the news, 78?
I don't remember details of it, but I do remember them expressing feelings of shock and awe that, wow, this actually is happening. Here we are 4 years later, 1978, and we have the priesthood, or access to it anyways.
Wow, okay.
But there were other stories too. Like I mentioned before, one of my siblings needed to be baptized, and they flew that sibling to Florida because that was the closest.
What?
Yeah, that was the closest place to have someone officiate in the priesthood. Because what happened at a certain time, the expats that were on the island were removed from the island.
Why?
I'm not sure the reason. Again,
business or government?
History's a little bit spotty. Okay. I believe it was a bit of both, business and government. Something changed, essentially, and they had to leave. And so my parents were left on the island in isolation as a family. So there were 4 Mormons on the island for a time. And my mother would take one child, my father would take the other child, teach them separately. They would collect their tithing, and without someone to pay it to, would just store it. So they would store that tithing, and when they would go to Florida, they would just say, here's all the tithing we saved.
And it's their own tithing.
Yeah.
What faith.
Yes. And
would they they couldn't pass the sacrament?
No,
so I wonder what their Sunday
there was no sacrament,
like.
But they would do talks and lessons, and they did the best they could.
Your dad to your mom to your dad?
Yep, basically, yeah.
When I opened an area with my companion on a mission, we did that. Our very first Sunday, it was just me and him, and we passed the sacrament to each other, had an opening prayer, closing prayer.
It's like
gave talks to each other.
30-minute meeting, right?
No, it was like 45 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And we prophesied that the area would grow. You know what I mean? And within 4 months, there were 40 people.
There you go. There you go.
I mean, the only reason it's not about me, but that's a magic thing to start out so small and humble with an eye towards growth. It's a magical thing. It was for me. I'm sure it was for them.
Absolutely. They have tremendous faith. That's my parents. They're salt of the earth people, just very humble, smart certainly, and have an ironclad conviction in what they believe. So there were experiences like that. You know, being willing to, you talk about, or you may have heard stories in the conference or ensign about people, selling cars to go to the temple. That's the kind of people my parents are. Not that they did, but just that they had faith such that, hey, it's time to baptize, or child, we're going to travel to Florida and get it done because that's what we need to do. So that's how far their faith took them.
Okay. So at some point, the church in Jamaica starts growing.
Yeah. So as soon as 78 happened, as soon as the revelation happened, that's when, hey, green light, we can send missionaries. I believe the first missionaries came in 1980 or 79. And that's when things really started taking off. When my dad was ordained, he brought friends into the church. So they started sharing the gospel with their friends, and quickly they grew into a branch of about 100 people.
This is in what city again?
So this is in a city or town called Mandeville. That's where I was born.
Is it near the capital?
It's in a parish. A parish is kind of like a state, or analogous to a state here in the United States. So that parish is where I was born, where he was working at the time, where they lived, and the town was Mandeville. So the Mandeville branch was the first branch on the island of Jamaica. The island was dedicated by Elder Ballard under a mangrove tree, I believe, in that town. And so as soon as the revelation happened, that's when leaders started coming and observing things. Is
that close to the main city, the capital of
It's about, if my memory serves me right, it's about a 2-hour drive.
And the main capital of Jamaica is?
Used to be a 2-hour drive. Now they have freeways, so I'm not entirely sure. But the capital is Kingston.
Kingston, okay.
Yeah, so
2 hours from Kingston.
Yes, so Mandeville was first, and then there was a Kingston branch established shortly after that.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then and you were born in 1980?
1982.
82.
Yes.
So tell us what it was like. Was your dad made branch president, like right off the bat?
Yeah, so my dad was always, as far as I recall, as a youth, he was always in some sort of leadership capacity in the church, from my recollection. It's interesting because each of us siblings have different understandings of who our parents were at different times. But for me, from my perspective, he was always in leadership, always the type of person that was kind of the backbone of the church, if you will. So
for the unit or for the whole country?
For the country, essentially.
Okay.
He wasn't a mission president, but he was the type of figure who everyone knew. And I mean, inside the church and outside, he was associated with Mormonism. Interestingly, the church, as it sought to be established as an officially recognized body on the island, he was one of those people who had to go to government and work with leaders and establish some rapport with them so that they wouldn't be so suspicious of the church. There was a lot of apprehension about the Mormon church. You have these two white guys showing up in white shirts and ties. People were wondering if they were the CIA or FBI. There was just a lot of paranoia about it. And so he did a lot of work, like I said, working with government, being on media, whether it was the radio doing interviews, kind of like I am here, or being on TV as well, being in a newspaper, writing articles, trying to establish some better perception of the church.
He was like an ambassador.
Basically, yeah. You could say he was a pioneer and ambassador for the church.
And I know this is minutia, but was he officially a branch president or a bishop
Yeah,
or stake
so
president or
he
district
was
president?
he was always either a branch president or district president.
Okay,
so
which is
equivalent to
stake
bishop
president.
or stake president. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So he did serve in those.
Yes.
And again, that's so sacred is of a family story to, like I've traveled, met church members in the UK, in Germany and in Switzerland. And there's always kind of that family or those kind of royal Mormon families that like are revered multi-generationally. And the stories are told, and when the state conference comes and the general authority comes, they tell the story about like when they first joined and when they first met. And that's culturally a very prominent, important, meaningful sort of legacy.
Yeah, in some ways, my family, I don't know if I'm being presumptuous here, but my perception is that my family was somewhat of a symbol to a lot of people because we were those pioneers. We were those people who were at every event, every function, every church service opportunity. Like that was us. And odds are, if you know someone from Jamaica who is Mormon, they know of my family, if not knowing us personally. So, yes, he was an ambassador of sorts.
So what was it like for you growing up Mormon in Jamaica?
So
what are your memories as a kid?
My earliest
as a kid
memories,
and a youth?
My earliest mememories were in nursery.
Okay.
I remember nursery.
Was there a chapel or were you in a home?
To this day, we had chapels, yes. So I was born in Mandeville. My earliest memories of the church would have been in a small town called Bogwalk, and that's where I grew up. We had a small building that was rented, I believe. I remember that chapel. I remember the blue hymn books. I remember when we switched to green hymn books. I remember setting the chairs out. I was, as friends and family would tell me, a mischievous kid. I would crawl under the pews and between people's legs and cause trouble. So that was Bogwalk. I will say, just to preface all of this, church in Jamaica for me was less spiritual, more social. If I were to look at both sides of community and the social aspects of the church, and also the spiritual side, it was definitely more of a social institution for me. So then we built a building in Linstead, which is a town. I'm not sure of the exact distance. I just remember it took about 10 minutes to get there. So Linstead was a bigger town, and we built a huge building. At least from my perspective, it was huge. 2 stories, chapel upstairs, cultural hall, classrooms, all that good stuff. It was the talk of the town because it was beautiful. It was well built. And I remember my father breaking ground for that building. I have that memory. But yeah, like I said, my earliest memories were in nursery. I remember the classes, the lessons, and even just thinking about it, I'm smiling because those were good times. Those were good, simple times when I remember just feeling love and happiness, and we were all in this thing together. We did feel peculiar, certainly, because we weren't like the other Christian churches, if you will. We didn't have a cross in our building. That was always something we had to explain. But yeah, for me, it was a good, happy time filled with love.
Do you remember your favorite primary songs?
I Hope They Call Me on a Mission.
Really?
Yeah. Book of Mormon Stories. Book of Mormon Stories that my teacher. I won't keep singing, but
Please sing.
Well, the tune of that song is somewhat disturbing, but because of the association there. But okay, so Book of Mormon Stories. Hope They Call Me on a Mission. Jesus Wants Me for a Sunbeam. Yeah, I'd say those are probably. Oh, Love One Another. I guess that's technically a primary song. But the primary hymn book at the time that we used was the orange primary hymn book. I don't know if you all remember that. And I remember switching to the new one and thinking, what is this? But those are some of my early memories.
This is a random question, but occasionally, so it was an English hymn book.
English hymn book.
Was it a localized Jamaican hymn book in any way?
No, it was not localized. This was a hymn book from the United States that we used.
Okay.
And we sang happily those songs.
Do you remember early identification with the United States and with America, the Osmonds, like any of that kind of stuff?
I didn't discover the Osmonds till later in my life, actually. I didn't really cue into their existence. To add a little bit of color and context to this as well, no pun intended, we had two TV stations. Well, actually, I grew up with one TV station on the island. So as far as media consumption goes, it was one source. So being exposed to American culture was somewhat limited until I was a bit older when we got a satellite dish, and that changed a lot for us. We were able to see American programming and American TV shows, and so I think culturally that started to influence me and just say my older sibling, who was also influenced by that. I think also, as I reflect on the past, we thought the missionaries were cool. So, two white guys, white shirts, ties, they were cool. So that's kind of the symbol that they represented for us. And yeah, we wanted to be like them. They were the cool guys. So there was likely some association created there of, hey, here's a white guy serving the Lord. I want to be like that. I want to be, and I hate to say it, but yeah, I want to be white like him, delightsome, if you will. And so on some level, really, I think just not so much outwardly expressed, but rather something I just kind of took on. The church represented what we aspired to be. It wasn't about, hey, in the context of being a Jamaican, what do I aspire to be? Everything was pointed toward Salt Lake, if you will.
Well, we talked a little bit about in our introduction description about cultural imperialism or whitewashing. And there's always this tension between local culture and kind of American white culture. And this tension between how much local culture is allowed to be incorporated into the Mormon church practice and beliefs versus, no, that's not how we do it in Salt Lake. That's not what we wear. That's not how we sing, or that's not what instruments. Do you remember any of those tensions at all?
Yeah, I don't remember them as tensions and manifesting themselves in any kind of argument or disputes, anything like that. But there were certainly uncomfortable moments, and maybe some of you viewers can relate somewhat. You've been on a mission, and someone goes up to the podium and they want to express themselves, and they do it in a way that's true and genuine to themselves, and then they get spoken to after, course corrected, if you will. So music is just a part of how we express ourselves. And by we, I mean myself, but also I think Jamaicans, we have a certain fondness, love for music. And it was difficult at times to see the response that was given to people who chose to express themselves through music. I mean, you can think of Fast and Testimony meeting or other instances where, they might want to sing a certain song. As far as the dialect goes, so in Jamaica we speak patois.
What is that?
As you can tell, I don't really have that accent. I can tell you why in a minute. Patois is essentially broken English. You can think of it that way, or pidgin English. You may have heard of that. So a lot of times it's combining words. So if I want to say "what's up," I could say "wagwan," right? So if I slow that down, "wagwan." It's like what's going on, or what going on, yeah. So wagwan. Or if I want to say what's happening, I can say wapm, what happened, right? So yeah, that's 2 words for you from patois. But
and just to make this explicit, and not trying to be sensitive to, not like asking you to perform for us, you know what I mean? Like, something that isn't explicit is you're speaking with no detectable accent to me. So to me, you sound like someone who was raised in the United States,
Yes,
right?
yes.
But that's not how you sounded growing up.
No, when I was growing up, I sounded more like this when I was growing up. There's a little bit more of a maybe angular tone to how you say things. So that's more of the Jamaican accent. And even speaking like this, if a Jamaican was listening to me, they would think, oh, you spent some time in the United States.
Because it's a little bit...
Because it's just a little bit off.
Okay.
And even, being away from the island for a time, now they use certain words and expressions that are different. Patois is a very organic language. It changes, it moves, it shifts depending on who you're speaking to. And also it changes depending on the time frame and context you're in. You make up words with your friends that you use or in your community. So it varies. You might use a word like shuggy and it means something to you and maybe 50 other people, but outside of that group, it means something else. So there's a lot of memes, if you will, to use that term.
When you speak in that original accent...
I'm going to shift back now.
Okay. And you said that's code shifting, right?
Yeah, code shifting. We can talk about that a little bit too. But
when you speak in that original and native accent for you, do you feel better, worse, awkward, more comfortable at home?
I feel more comfortable, but it's oh man, I think it's part of the context I'm in. So if you're a black person from Jamaica, for example, I wouldn't even think about it. But there's a certain mental...
You would speak...
I would just speak like I would... I speak...
Would you code shift immediately?
Yeah, immediately I would go Jamaican, yes.
Okay.
Yes, because that's what would feel comfortable. I think there's just a subconscious response to the situation I'm in that's causing me right now to even feel more comfortable speaking with my acquired Utah accent. But your question about code shifting, yes, I think, and feeling comfortable with my family, particularly my parents, I don't even think about it. It just happens, or with friends.
Okay. Thank you for helping us understand that.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Okay. So I imagine at some point you would have either noticed the leaders that came from Salt Lake, general authorities, whatever, area authorities, and or gotten to watch videos or live streams of General Conference at some point and noticed that all the Mormons in the United States were pretty much white, right?
Yeah, every now and then we would see a black person and it was delightful because I would think to myself, oh, there's someone like me. Wow, okay, there's someone like me. But yes, the majority of people were white. At least for me growing up, every mission president was a white person. It was very likely that the counselors were white. It shifted after some time, but there was certainly the feeling that we were just doing things wrong. I remember feeling like, oh, there's not enough priesthood holders, or oh, you're saying this or doing this the wrong way. I do have some memories, going back to your initial question of growing up, of correlation meetings. I remember walking in and I think my mom was on the correlation committee at some point. They had committee meetings every few Sundays, and my understanding is that was just to make sure everyone was all aligned and on the same page, right? That was what used to happen, just to make sure there weren't any aberrations or just odd things happening with how we did things and why we did things. But I would say the feeling I had, just an underlying feeling, was the church in Utah, the United States, they're doing it right. We're doing it wrong. And there was always this effort to get it right.
A feeling of you're always doing it wrong and trying to get it right.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound totally comfortable, but also I guess it gives you something to strive for, right? Becoming
a stake was the overarching goal of my life, or at least that was presented to us. It was like that was the milestone, that was the next step. We dreamed of having a temple, for example, but we had to have righteous priesthood holders. And culturally, I would without getting too much on a tangent, Jamaicans, we like to be free. And
So there's an independent streak.
yeah, there's an independent streak. You know, we were liberated from slavery. We got our in, and then we were under British control until 1962. That's our independence, August 6th, 1962. And so, yeah, there's an independent streak. We take pride in ourselves, at least normal Jamaicans do. I'm not a normal Jamaican. And so for the men, I think it seemed like it was a struggle to get active, consistent LDS men who were committed to that thing for one reason or another, whether it was, hey, there worthiness issues or just commitment falling off. So demographically speaking, there was always an imbalance of active, what they would call worthy males to females, and so we were always, for the majority of my life, anyways, outside of the realm of possibility of having a stake, and that didn't happen until after I left the island.
And I experienced that in Latin America, just in developing countries. I guess the rules, the standards, word of wisdom, law of chastity, tithing, and probably just other cultural factors made it way harder to baptize a man than a woman and her children.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Still, there was a certain aspirational quality or appeal to the church. Hey, these people are from America. They seem to have great families, and it felt at times, and again, I'm reading into things from a distance, but that Mormonism was a gateway to a better life, if you will. Yeah. And it's that hope and aspirational outlook and mindset that was appealing to a lot of people.
You talk, I mean, this is just a side, but I remember people in Guatemala confusing us with the CIA.
Yes.
Mormon missionaries with the CIA.
Yeah. So
there were reasons for that.
Yeah.
Have you studied that at all?
I have not studied that at all, but I do remember, we'd be out with the missionaries as kids, and people would yell at them, CIA, FBI, and we're just like, what? What are you talking about?
There's a classic book called The Ugly American that chronicled, in the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, and the Johnson administration, how we would send CIA agents to developing countries, sometimes destabilize their governments, sometimes overthrow their leaders, sometimes imposing our own dictators. There's a large history in Chile and Guatemala and other countries of us doing really shady things.
Yeah, there's a Bob Marley documentary. Some of you may be familiar with Bob Marley, rather. But there's a documentary on Netflix that alludes to that, CIA interfering with things, and some fear that Jamaica would become a communist or significantly socialist stronghold in the Caribbean.
Yeah, Cold War, right?
You had Cuba, Jamaica. So there was some concern. There's history of the CIA infiltrating South America and influencing the outcome of political movements there. So, yeah, it's not outside the realm of possibility, certainly.
Yeah. So what about when I mentioned kind of general authorities and leaders from the States coming, part of that was the skin color reference. So, I mean, tell me what it's like to grow up as a boy, seeing Spencer B. Kimball, your namesake, right? Seeing General Conference, noticing that all the leaders are white, all the leaders coming over from Salt Lake are white, and you're all dark-skinned. And you've got the Bruce R. McConkie-like teachings about worthiness in the pre-existence, and you've got the Book of Mormon teachings of dark skin being a curse. So were you aware of all that as a kid?
I was aware, but I accepted and trusted in my parents' faith. I borrowed light from them for some time, and as much as things didn't make sense to me, then I brushed them aside. I tried to focus on, remember I mentioned happiness and love, those feelings that I had, camaraderie with the saints there. That's what carried me through ultimately. I certainly had my questions, even as a young kid, but quickly those were moved to the side. As far as seeing the white faces on TV, just to give you a little or paint a picture of what conference was like. So twice a year, April, October. There were, I think, 2 satellite dishes on the island that could receive conference. Actually, there was one for a long time, and it was just in Kingston. I think we added one in Mandeville. And so every member from the island would descend on Kingston because there was no way to watch it at home. I remember coming to the United States, for example, and hearing that people watch conference at home and thinking, wow, this is so strange. You just watch it at home in your PJs? That's weird. So we would charter buses, large coach liner buses, and it was awesome, John. It was awesome. I remember, people would. This is what I loved about the church. People would cook food, and we would sing songs along the way, and it was this event, this big event. We didn't spend the night, so there would be a trip into Kingston, a trip back, a trip to Kingston, a trip back. People would save their money so they could buy a ticket to get on the bus, but it was an awesome, happy time. I don't remember the talks as much because, I probably nodded off or tried to escape a few times as a kid, but just the memory, and it's all coming back now. I can just see those people and taste the food and hear the songs, and it was a special time. So that was conference, and then you see the people on TV. To get back to your question, and
no, really quick, what are some of the food dishes that you remember most associated with?
So we eat a lot of rice. We eat a lot of rice. It's a coconut rice with red kidney beans. Super delicious. And there was always some sort of stewed or slow cooked chicken dish with spices. Jamaica, as I mentioned, after or during slavery, rather. Was it during or after? I think it was under British rule anyways. A lot of Asian influence and also Indian influence came in. And by that I mean East Indian. So curry was a big thing. We would have curried goat, curried chicken. There were just the salads and fresh fruit, the drinks.
What are some of the big fruits in Jamaica?
Mangoes. I mean, I grew up, one of the houses I grew up in, we had a tree. We called it the head mango tree because this thing would produce mangoes that were the size of your head. And the tree, we had to prop up the limbs so the tree wouldn't split. Like that was something. But yeah, mangoes were good. Bananas, plantains. Oh, fried plantains are so good.
With cream?
When they're ripe. Nope, just ripe, a little bit of salt. We'd have jackfruit. It's kind of like durian, but doesn't smell as bad. It's this huge thing that just grows on the side of a tree. There was starfruit. We had these things called guineps. At least we call them guineps, but they're similar to lychees. If you've ever had a lychee, just really good. We would, as far as candy goes, tamarind balls, we would eat those. They were just tamarind fruit rolled in brown sugar, and you kind of got this tangy, sour with sweet combination. Oh, so good. Anyhow, I could go on and on about the food.
Is there an authentic Jamaican restaurant in Salt Lake that you're
There's one in Park City, actually.
Is it good?
It's called 11 House. Shout out to 11 House. Actually went there 2 weeks ago. It's pretty good.
Like, is it legit?
Yeah, it's legit.
Okay.
It's
I'll have
legit
to check
for sure.
that out.
Yeah, check it out. It's I don't remember exactly where. It's near this New Park Hotel, I think it's called. But
do you remember any of your favorite hymns that you would sing standing in general conference that you loved? Did you love that part of it, standing with everyone singing?
I loved, if we ever sang Call to Serve, How Firm a Foundation. Loved that song. What was the other one? I Believe in Christ. Those were probably the top ones that I just loved singing.
Do you remember any favorite parts of the scriptures or scripture stories or inspired by any prophets?
I was never the best
history?
Scripture reader,
Okay.
Admittedly. But as far as scripture stories go, I would say I leaned more heavily into the Book of Mormon. So that was kind of my thing. Always, I guess not now, but always loved Nephi's story and kind of the progression of things there. The Stripling Warriors was one. I believe it was. See, the names are fading now. is it Nephi and Lehi in the book of Helaman, their story. But yeah.
Sons of Mosiah.
Yeah, Sons of Mosiah. Yes. The one where the Book of Mormon's really violent if you think about it, but the one where
Ammon.
Yeah, Ammon, and when he's cutting the arms off the poor Lamanites. But yeah.
Do you remember?
As a kid, that's what I liked.
Do you remember what you were taught about Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or any of the early church leaders? Any of that stuff?
Yes.
Were they important to you? Not.
It's a bit fuzzy, but Joseph Smith, he was mentioned, but I wouldn't say emphasized so much. Not as much as here. And the time between his death to, say, the modern prophets isn't something that ever was talked about. Polygamy was never talked about or really referenced. It was just a thing we used to do that's, been resolved. But yeah, there wasn't a tremendous emphasis on that beyond, hey, here's the Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, Book of Abraham, all of that.
Okay. So would you have gone to ward dances, stake dances, district dances?
Yeah.
Youth. What were youth activities like as a young adult or as a young man, young woman?
Again, smiling as I think about this because those were some of the best times. Still friends with a lot of those people to this very day. Dances were few and farther between than they are here. It was more similar to conference, more of a big event. I remember, and maybe some of you laugh at this, I remember going to maybe 2 dances, but I do remember them specifically. One of them was we did a 70s retro night, was it night or evening, whatever, dance. So I did that. And then there was another one that I went to in Kingston as well, as a youth. But youth programs somewhat struggled in Jamaica. I mean, as a teacher, for example, you might be the only teacher in your area.
Meaning teachers in that
age group,
14 to 15 boy.
or 16, whatever the age is.
Okay, so not some big thriving youth.
Yeah. No, I mean, one of my best friends who, I think he's a bishop now, it was just me and him for a while. We'd be in class and it was just me and him and our teacher.
So no multi-group Sunday schools.
I remember coming to Utah.
Primaries, a couple kids.
Yeah, I remember being, I think I was 15 or 16, coming to Utah and spending a few days and going to a ward in Orem. And I think I went to a youth activity and just being completely blown away at the number of youth and the fact that there were people in each age category. It just felt awesome.
But yet, do you think about that time with fondness?
I do, because again, it was about love, camaraderie, and those feelings. It wasn't so much about the doctrinal soundness. I mean, that would come later in life, particularly as I was getting ready for a mission, having to make sense of things and like, oh wow, okay, I've really got to read this Book of Mormon thing that I'm gonna go out and teach people about. So yeah, it was more about the fondness. There was no scouting program even in Jamaica. I went on one camp out with some youth once, but that was it. So I'm the last person you want to have around in a zombie apocalypse. I won't be able to keep us alive.
So no seminary?
I did have seminary. Seminary is a little different. We would meet after school, not before, and it was in the evenings. My mother was my seminary teacher. So that was interesting because there was no getting out of doing those assignments and reading assignments, even though I pushed the limits of that a bit here and there. But yeah, she would teach us seminary, and then after seminary there was institute. So she would teach seminary, sometimes teach institute, or my dad would teach institute, or there were other teachers called eventually. And because we had one vehicle or two at certain points, but I wasn't driving certainly, so I'd hang around after seminary, either do my homework or play ping pong. That's what I loved doing, ping pong and basketball. There was a basketball hoop at the church, but it was in the parking lot, and we would play ping pong in the cultural hall.
To what extent did you guys do family prayer, family scripture study, family home evening, or not?
That's a great question. And again, I think this answer would just be totally different for my siblings. I remember not being perfect in those things at home. We would pray every day. Family home evening, I always hated it. I always did. Sorry, mom and dad, but I always hated it. And so it was a struggle. I would say it tapered off the older we got, as kids. But it's something we tried to do, spend time together as family. Sometimes we'd go to the beach. Sometimes we would go to a restaurant in Kingston, which was a big deal because it was, a 30-minute drive, and we were excited to have that experience. It's not like here where, I can walk down the street and have some delicious food. So it was an event. But as far as the little things go, prayer, scripture study, it wasn't so much study as it was sharing a verse here or there. We had this huge family Bible that we would read from time to time, and I can see it and I can feel it right now. It's just this big white Bible with embossed letters and very heavy binding. I wish I had that right now, but just because of the memory, But my dad would read from that Book of Mormon. We would do Book of Mormon stories. Sometimes we would watch film strips or videos. So yeah.
What role did the word of wisdom and the law of chastity play in your teen years
in
Jamaica?
Oh boy. Heavy question. So not really, but being candid, I was very by the book, letter of the law, straight-laced as a kid. I didn't really have any, by Mormon standards, indiscretions with people that were super serious. I mean, as a kid, you're curious, and you happen upon things, whether it's porn or experiences with the opposite sex, which actually is interesting if your dad's your branch president, right? He's the one you're working through things with. So I was a virgin till I was married, at least as far as the traditional definition of that interaction goes. I did encounter pornography as a kid, and so that's something that weighed heavily on me for many, many years, which ties into the weight and body image side of things. But I think for me, it was something that I was content with keeping to myself because of an attempt to just preserve the image of, hey, there's this pioneer family and we're all great. Everything's fine. We're good. We don't talk about things. So, if there were either of those two things, word of wisdom, law of chastity, I would say law of chastity was probably the thing I had the most liberty with, if you could say that. Word of wisdom, in the strictest definition of Mormonism, I didn't necessarily, I wasn't the healthiest. Like I said, it was tied to my depression around not meeting the expectations of this family we were supposed to be. Not being the best, not being perfect, be you therefore perfect, you had even though we didn't have the most robust youth program, I remember Mormons from Utah who would have firesides. We had a lot of firesides. That's the other thing. But we'd have these firesides and you'd hear the story of the licked cupcake or the chewed gum. That was one I remember. And I was distressed over that for so long. I remember seminary lessons where, people who broke the law of chastity were called sexual deviants. And just that word, I didn't even know what it meant at the time, but I just felt, just icky. And
did they mean masturbation, or did they mean
it was a lesson about masturbation?
Homosexuality? It was
masturbation specifically, and
okay. So you had that pressure and shame.
Yeah, absolutely. That was something that was core to at least my experiences as a Mormon is that shame, that that pressure to be perfect, and somewhat compounded by the context I was in. You know, I felt like I had
And your
this,
family, right?
Yeah, I felt like we had a mantle, we had a banner. You described my dad as an ambassador, and yeah, he was. But I had that weight that I felt like.
What's the dark side of that? Like, I would think, oh, you're ambassadors, you're pioneers, everyone loves you. And yeah, you're striving to be as good as you can. That all sounds really good. Is there a dark side to those high expectations and the perfectionism? And if so, how does that play out in?
Oh man.
Or is that not a thing? I don't want to create a thing.
No. It's a thing. Certainly. I always felt like I had to be the best. And if I wasn't the best, I wasn't worthy, or worth consideration. I don't know. I wanted to be always an example. We were always trying to do our best to get it right. You know, kind of like I talked about, we were always doing it wrong, and I wanted to get it right. And so if there was any sin on my part, I internalized that a lot, and I could just feel those emotions coming. It's something I struggled with. I have journals just filled with comments about how horrible I was because, this week you messed up again, or why can't you get this right? You know, what's wrong with you? Just those feelings of me not even loving myself or accepting myself. And so I would resort to things that I thought at the time made me feel good, like eating, or could have been indiscretions on my part. But yeah, those things comforted me, if you will, on a certain level. So there was tremendous pressure. At least I perceived it as tremendous pressure. Whether or not that's real, I wanted to be the best, and I wasn't always the best. Sorry, everyone. But yeah.
So the pressures brought with them a lot of guilt and shame.
Yeah, and
which then led to self-medication.
Absolutely. Whether it was, like I said, I was actually exposed to porn at school in 3rd grade. I remember someone brought a magazine, but that kind of set things off. And so that's something I had to work through. And it's interesting because the desire to even see or experience that completely went away, having transitioned out, as opposed to being in,
right.
Feeling.
It's all of a sudden how uninteresting that porn can become once you don't have the rule of not looking at it.
Huh. Okay. Well, I don't have to feel bad about this thing I did forever ago, because I don't know if I'm going to hell or not. We can talk about that later. But that pressure was there, certainly.
Okay.
Just to be the best I could be.
And the discrepancy between the public face and the private experiences.
Yeah,
that's
so
hard to...
I talk about code shifting a bit, and context shifting, if you will. Yeah, when you go to church, you show a certain face. When you're on your own, there's a different you. I think we all implicitly do that to certain extents, but for me, there was certainly my teens were a turbulent time internally speaking. And I didn't always find the healthiest ways to manage those feelings.
But you weren't viewed as a rebellious youth.
No, I was
very devout.
I was viewed as very devout, very much an example,
right,
to follow.
Your parents are still alive, and they're still very faithful, and you're very close to them. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a delicate question, but I imagine, as it is in the States, when a family is sort of like held up in high esteem and trying to convey the appearance of real faithfulness, or actually just, living faithfully, there's a lot of this pressure from parent to child of like, you've got to, the family name, the reputation, our status, that can probably affect different families in different ways, but I could see a certain type of family where it's like strict, and, kids aren't necessarily encouraged to pursue self-expression, or maybe it doesn't really matter what they really think or feel or want to do. You got to kind of follow the rules, keep up the family name. There's a strictness and maybe an impersonality that can come maybe in some family contexts, as parents are trying to make sure their kids portray the right things. Was that a thing or not so much?
I would say it wasn't explicitly so. There's, I guess, along my story, there's implicit and explicit things, meaning, overt, covert. From my parents, it was always subtle. I carried, I won't speak for my siblings. I carried the expectation that I was promising essentially to carry on this legacy, to always be the best, always be this pioneer. When we introduced ourselves, it wasn't, hey, we're the Nugents, and that's it. It was, hey, we're the Nugents, we're the first members of the church in Jamaica. Nice to meet you. Oh, what's your story? And then that became a thing. So with that, we carried that pressure along. As far as my parents go, though, it's always just been a subtle feeling that they do want me to be a certain way. But I haven't had too many awkward conversations where there's been an overt expression of dissatisfaction with myself.
Okay. So, any other thing about your kind of upbringing, high school, your family experience, before we talk about high school, whatever, before we talk about your family's move to Utah?
Let me think on that. I mean, for what it's worth, I was always studious. My family really stressed education and just always being the best at whatever we did. So maybe that's kind of where I get my tendency to always want to be the best at things. But in high school, certainly, always in the top of my class. By that I mean, top 5, if not top 10. Jamaica, the educational system was ranked. So your opportunity in life was somewhat determined by your effort as you applied it to your studies. So, for example, to get into a good high school, you had to take an examination at the end of elementary school. That examination would cover a variety of topics, and you're stack ranked across the island based on your scores. Based on your scores, you're able to essentially select which high school you want to go to. So it's not so much region dependent as it is here. As long as you can get to that school, you're welcome. Well, get to and pay for, because there is a tuition associated with many schools. So as long as you could get there and you were smart enough, you were good to go. So I think that's somewhat where my tendency to want to perform and be great at things comes from. It's my parents' emphasis on education, but it's probably somewhat influenced by the church as well. That idea of being perfect and always getting it right. You're saved by works, not by grace, that kind of thing. I was on my high school chess team. Love chess. We've played chess.
We've played chess.
We have.
And you slaughtered me.
I did.
Under most contexts.
And then you got me back. Yeah. I had a little handicap, but you got me back. But yeah, let's see. Didn't really, as far as like dating as a teen, had to wait till I was 16, right? Officially. Didn't technically have a girlfriend or really have a girlfriend, but went out several times. Not really out. It was more. It wasn't so much going on a date as it was hanging out. Is what I did anyways. But yeah, didn't have a ton of experience till I eventually moved to the United States.
Did you mention if you played sports? Did I miss that?
I didn't. Well, I did try out for my basketball team. That was not great. Tried out for the ping pong team at my high school. But I just enjoyed ping pong and basketball quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else about life in Jamaica before the move?
I think that's about it. I'm sure questions will come up along the way. So